If you want to ask questions, go ahead. I will ask you a question because I see two options. Now I want to talk about neural networks, but I also have another part of the lecture which is on this system here, which is K-log. And also I have another part of the lecture which is about graphs with continuous attributes, meaning that you have real numbers, right? When you have real numbers, what is the problem with real numbers? That you cannot do the match, the exact match, right? Like in Python, double equal, the equality test on real numbers doesn't really make sense, right? You have to do something like, they are close, right, to numbers. Same problem with kernels, except that for kernels it becomes a lot more complicated. So this part here will be, here there is no mathematical things, it's more programming and Prolog. The kernels on continuous attributes is very technical and mathematical, so it depends if you're tired and you want to relax, maybe you want to listen to this. For me it's the same. So how many people vote for listening to something about K-log for like 10 minutes, or doing otherwise kernels for graphs with continuous attributes in the nodes or in the edges? So for K-log and for the continuous attributes, yeah, all right. Okay, I will go for K-log because I understand. I mean, the other one you can check a bunch of papers. There are a few interesting papers on that. But you can also think that you can use neural networks which don't really have this problem of distinguishing between discrete and continuous attributes. So K-log, well, it's in a sense it's a fairly simple idea. Okay. The idea is that you can do general relational learning. So I talked about learning on graphs, but with K-log you can do general relational learning. So you can really write your problem in a declarative way and use Prolog as your language. So if you like Prolog and if you know how to do things in Prolog, what you can do is not only declaring your problem, but you can also declare your background knowledge about the problem. That's a good thing, in a sense, because with these kernels, well, as I said at the beginning, if you don't have enough background knowledge, you don't know which features are important, you don't know exactly what to get out of your graphs, what is the best way of doing the comparison between graphs. In general relational domains, you might have some, hints about what works, and that's something you can convert into useful information for doing kernel-based classification, so to say, right? So K-log is essentially two things. One is Prolog for representing the problem, the data set and the problem plus the background knowledge. Then this stuff is mapped into a graph, and then is a graph kernel on the top of it. So it's fairly simple, conceptually, right? So I have to give you just a few details how this works, okay? But once you have it, you can do a lot of things. Like you can classify molecules or graphs, but you can also take a single graph and classify the individual vertices in the graph, or entities in a relational domain, or you can classify links or hyperlinks and do link prediction things, right? Which are not obvious. For example, if you take just a graph kernel, how do you do link prediction? Well, you need features of the link. So you need features of pairs of vertices, right? So how do you do that? Well, you can play tricks. Like, for example, you take a subgraph nearby one vertex, another subgraph nearby another one, and combine these two guys and compute a kernel these pairs of things and do the classification. In a sense, K-log is kind of automating this process, right? So let me do this with a simple, super stupid example. The example was invented by Pedro Domingos 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, to illustrate Markov logic networks that maybe you heard about already, maybe not, I don't know. Maybe you heard about that tomorrow? Yeah, okay. Anyway, so it's a classic academic domain. This is the entity relationship diagram of the entity relationship diagram. So this is the student and the professor. The professor has an attribute like the kind of position, like it's permanent or associate or assistant professor, whatever. Then the student also has a phase, like, I don't know, sophomore or graduate student, whatever. I mean, and advised by, you know, actually those guys are PhD students. So, so the phase could be after the first year exam, or passing all the exams, writing the thesis, whatever. Okay. And then there is this relationship here, advised by, that you would like to predict. So it's a link prediction problem. You want to predict who's the advisor of whom. And okay, so it's a stupid, toy problem, but it illustrates the thing. So this is K-log. You basically declare your entities and your relationships. Okay, it's a kind of annotated prologue. So it's about a standard prologue with some annotations. So you have to basically declare the student with this keyword here. You explain to the system that this is actually an entity, right? Whereas in phase, since it has two things, like a student ID, which is a type student, which is here, it means it's actually not an entity, but a property in a sense. So it's a relationship, unary relationship in this case, of the student. Okay, bringing in the attribute. Same thing for the professor, and this is the target relation. Then you have this keyword here, extensional. What does it mean? Extensional, it means simply that the tuples for this particular thing, you will find that in the database, in the data. Okay? By contrast, intentional signatures are something that you can write down the rules in Prolog to obtain the tuples. They're not given in the data, but you can compute them from the data, okay, using Prolog declarations. And that's where you put your background knowledge. So this stuff is given, is in the data. And if you look at the data, this is what the data looks like. That's the data set from Pedro Domingo, except is converted into Prolog syntax. But I mean, this is the list of students, the list of professors with their identifiers, whether, for example, person 292 is a faculty affiliate, and this other one is faculty. This student, it's post-qualifications, pre-qualifications. Then you have other things, which I didn't mention before, like publications, for example, right? That this guy published this paper, which identifier title 25. Then you know which person taught which courses. Okay, all these things you can also, of course, you can declare here and add the corresponding signatures also for this kind of things that you have in the data set, if you want to use them. Or if you don't want to use them, you don't declare them here, but you use them in the intentional signatures. Intentional is what? For example, this is an example of intentional signature, right? On same paper. Well, why I'm writing this? because I mean, I do this job, and so I know very well that normally when you advise a student, you are co-author on some of their papers, right? Normally. Well, of course, it could happen that the student writes paper by himself or by themselves, but it's a bit unusual, right? So obviously, this is bringing in some useful information in the system, right? Because it's background knowledge. Now, this is trivial because everybody knows about this stuff, but think about, I mean, given this problem to someone who didn't have academic exposure, and so they don't know how the system works, or think about something similar maybe in a domain that you don't know, okay? So here's where the experts come in and tell you what is important. And of course, I can imagine that if they are in the same paper, that's a good feature for predicting who's the advisor or whom, right? And so this one will be a new, you see, a new box here, actually a new diamond, which is a relationship, right? Which is created in Prolog. And that's a simple rule for, in Prolog to declare that. Okay, I think everybody can read that, right? Can you read Prolog, I guess? Yeah, okay. So this is another one on same course. Well, why? Again, well, if you're my student, maybe I will invite you to be the TA in my course, right? So that's another feature that might be important. I might prefer my student than some random student to be the TA in my course. But maybe this is less strongly correlated than that. Okay? But I can also add things like that, for example. If I priori don't know, well, I can try, right? And put in there. And once I have this, okay, what I can do is to move from interpretations. An interpretation is what? An interpretation is simply a relational database, right? An instance of a relational database. And I can change this into a bipartite graph. Remember, a relational database is a hypergraph, right? You're with me on that? It's a hypergraph because the tuples are hyperedges, right? Now, what you can do is that, okay, I mean, if I take this hypergraph and essentially, you can think of the hypergraph as a factor graph, where you can factorize the things that occur simultaneously in a tuple, and put the vertex, a special vertex, to represent the fact that they co-occur, and link the special vertex to everything. And since you go for entity relationships things, this special vertex has to be a relationship, okay? Because otherwise it wouldn't connect anything. Only relationships do connect things. So you take these relationships and you connect them to the instances of the objects if they appear in the same tuple. So, for example, if Professor 407 and student 21 appear in the same paper, then you put these two edges in there. And if you repeat that hard enough for the entire data set, this is what you get. You get a big graph. Okay? And it's a bipartite graph because you have, boxes and diamonds, depending whether it's a relationship or it's an entity. And it's annotated by all these possible informations that you already have. Okay? Good enough. Okay. So once you have this graph, what can you do? Well, a lot of things. You can extract a feature vector and do learning, for example. Okay? So any graph kernel can be plugged in. Any graph kernel. And in particular, we plugged in, actually something I did a few years ago. We plugged in NSPDK. NSPDK is remember the kernel looking at pairs of balls, right? I'm doing the match with the hashing. Yeah. So I'm not giving you all the gory details, doesn't matter. But also this one, let me skip it because I want to be fast. But I can declare some special vertices in the graph to be kernel points, meaning that I will compute the balls only on the kernel points, not everywhere. This is to reduce the complexity and is also to inform the system that some parts are more important than others. So I want to extract features not everywhere, but only in particular places of the graph, right? Like, for example, in the crucial entities. And so or in the crucial relationships. And that could be my kernel points, and then I will do the, the pairs of balls in all possible pairs of kernel points. So it's like NSPDK, but focusing on some particular nodes, which I can declare in Prolog somewhere in the program. And then, it's the computation I did before. So you take these pairs, you do the hashing, and you do the hashing, you keep doing the hashing for all of them, and then you sum up the result, and you get a feature vector. Okay? That's what we did before. So let's say, as a notation now, X and Y, there are sets of ground atoms in Prolog, where X are given and Y are the ground atoms you want to predict. Okay? You want to make predictions, like advised by. You want to predict who is the advisor of whom. So advised by will be in Y. Well, once you have it, you can do this graphicalization procedure. You convert your data set into a graph. You generate the feature, and you get a feature vector of X and Y. Fairly simple. Once you have it, what can you do? Well, you can design a classifier on top of it, a potential in particular, which is a function of X and Y, which is a real number now, right? That will tell you how compatible is the particular Y with a given X, right? And then, how do you do the classification? Well, the classification, you just solve this inference problem. You argmax F with respect to Y. You find the assignment of truth to the ground atoms for the advised by relationship that maximize this stuff here, this compatibility function, right? That's pretty much like what you do in graphical models. Okay, so if you think about Markov logic networks, they do pretty much the same here. They maximize the stuff. Well, how difficult is this maximization problem? Remember, this Y here is not one single thing. It's a bunch of all the ground atoms for the advised by. So for every possible pair of student-professor, there is one atom here. So this looks like innocent, but this is really an exponential number of possible assignments for Y. So this is huge. No surprise that, except in special cases, this problem is intractable. Does anybody guess in which case this becomes tractable? Polynomial, again. It's the same thing as in constrained programming, in which case a constrained program is tractable. When the constrained network is acyclic, when it's a tree, right? Same story here. When the links are such that it's a tree, well, trees are easy, because when you make an assignment, you don't have to change your mind. You can be greedy. When there is a cycle, maybe your guess is disproved by a path that goes back, and you're in trouble, right? That's where the intractability comes from. So in general, this is bad. Actually, K-log solved this problem in a super greedy way. And the super greedy way is the following. We take a so-called viewpoint A viewpoint is a pair of entities that are supposed to be classified. We mutilate the graph, meaning that every other advised by is deleted. Okay? Is deleted. Why is deleted? Because, well, you're not supposed to look into things that you're supposed to predict. And we only keep this one. Okay? So this will be kept. This will be deleted. This will be deleted. This will be deleted. The rest you can keep it because it's an X. It's data that you're given. And then once you can have constructed this mutilated graph, you apply the feature generation on this mutilated graph. With the constraint that when you do the balls for the kernel, the centers of the balls should be in these two guys. They cannot be everywhere because you're focusing on this student and this professor. And so you end up with a particular feature vector which is specific for the student and this professor. And you classify all of them independently. Okay? It's a huge difference because here you would do collective classification. Okay? So you take into account what in this example? What is the advantage of that with respect to doing IID predictions like this? How many advisors do you have if you're a PhD student? So, who is a PhD student here? How many advisors you have? One. I know people that they have 2 co-advisors. Okay? But can you have like 5 co-advisors? No, right? So, obviously, when you do this, how can you prevent a prediction where the same student is co-advised by 5 professors? It could happen. If you do that, for sure, the system will learn a feature that it's impossible. And so, by collective classification, if this is, this professor is the advisor, it reduces the probability that another professor will be advisor. And so, collective classification is more informed. Okay? So it can do better in principle. In practice, it's not necessarily the case. But anyway, this is just to show you how simple it looks. This is the entire script. It's not the data set. The data set is in another file. But this is an entire script in a single Prolog file. Okay? There are some predefined predicates to do the learning. The learning is done, in this case, as a k-fold cross-validation. Incidentally, in this domain, there are interpretations or distinct instances of databases correspond in the computer science department of the University of Washington. There are a bunch of different research groups, and each research group is a different interpretation. Okay, so it's a different database. Yeah, and this is what you get comparing. These are recall precision curves of K-log versus Markov logic networks. Markov logic networks can actually do collective classification. Okay, so in principle they are more informed. In practice, they don't actually work better, as you can see. So kernels are quite powerful. One reason is that Markov logic networks have to solve an approximate inference problem, and the approximation, could not be that fantastic. The way you insert the background knowledge could not be as fantastic as here, because here I inserted a very nice piece of background knowledge. Being the same paper is so important. I created nodes for that will link those entities, and so those entities will be pre-linked, and the system will learn a lot from that. Okay, so it works. And we did it for, well, this is interesting. This is a database of movies. This is not a bunch of interpretations. This is one single interpretation. There is only one one IMDb. It's not like there are 10 different planets with 10 different cinematographies, right? There's only one. And so even splitting the data means that you take the data from the past and you predict the data for the future. And the way it works is simply by doing this kind of tricks. These are the prediction you want to do is whether, this is a blockbuster movie. Blockbuster means in the first weekend, during the opening weekend, you make more than, $2 million. Okay, so it's like the Avengers, maybe, okay, these kind of things, right? Yeah, and you want to do this prediction. So, well, I think it's not too hard to come up. I mean, the database, by the way, contains the obvious relationships. If you go to IMDb, you can download it in MySQL format, right? And it contains what? Well, this actor acted in this movie. This movie was directed by this director. This company did the production or did the special effects, or all this kind of obvious things that you find on IMDb when you go and browse the web pages, right? This is what you find in the database. It's pretty simple to figure out what you find there. So now, what do you think is a good predictor for being a blockbuster? I mean, you don't have to be an expert in movies, right, to figure out. What is a good feature? The cast. The cast, right? So how do you know whether a cast is good or not? You got features, right? You got features like the actor maybe won some award, right? Or they, well, most importantly, the most important feature is this one, actually. Okay, this one. So, if you are an actor who acted in another blockbuster movie, you're likely to bring the score for blockbusterness of this other movie up, right? Because normally you invite the famous actors to make money because you have to pay them a lot, and so they correlate strongly, right? So this is the single, this is quite tricky, right? Because you have to use some background knowledge to invent it. But once you write it down, it's one line of code. You count basically what is the blockbuster cast length. So how many actors acted in a blockbuster movie that you have in your cast, and you count them. And you can do the same for directors. You can do the same for producing companies, for special effect companies, maybe for, I don't know, for the editor, for whatever, right? And, well, you go and do your prediction. Actually, the data is split in this way, right? When you train, you have to train on past movies, and when you test, you have to go to the future. This is because there is only one single big graph. So you want to be sure that you don't mix up train and test. Okay? And so one simple way is that when you do the training, basically you don't see the future. So in training, maybe these years here are grayed out because you cannot see, you're not authorized to see. You delete them from you delete the data from the data set for training. And when you go for test, you can see the past. So you can also see the whys for the past. That's legal, of course, right? As part of the data. Yeah, and this is, for example, I think this is interesting. Markov logic, again, it does collective classification. Take It's faster than K-log in this particular case, but it's a lot less accurate. Tilde, which is a relational learning based on decision trees, is also a little bit better than Markov logic, but look at the timing. Okay, so K-log is a good trade-off in terms of good accuracy and good prediction times. So if you want to give it a try, it's downloadable and you can use it. All right. Let me move to the second part. Which I will start. Actually, we're not going to talk about high-dimensional and continuous attributes, right, as promised. I will start with neural networks. And then, if there is time, I will talk about multi-instance learning and some other architectures you can apply for that. So let me start with neural networks. By the way, if you are interested in this graphs for continuous attributes, I will give you the names. One is propagation. One is called propagation kernels. You can ask Christian Kirsten, who's in the audience, about the stuff. Another one is graph hopper, and another one is graph invariant kernels, which you can ask either me or Luke, because we are co-authors in this paper. So, yeah. All right. Okay, neural networks. Neural networks, now the idea is that this vector phi, you want to learn it, how to get it from the data. It's not predefined anymore, okay? You want to learn the representation for this stuff here. Once you do this, well, again, you can plug it into a predictor and do some loss minimization or regularized loss minimization to fit the weights. But in this case, you can think that, in this minimization problems, not only W is involved, but also some parameters of this guy here. Right? Also some parameters. So you can think about the composition of the functions. So the classifier now has some parameters W, and you split these parameters into representation parameters and prediction parameters. The representation parameters, WR, parameterize the mapping from X to phi of X to the representation. Whereas the prediction parameters, W0, will be just used to do linear classification on the top of it. Okay, that's the idea. And now this phi is maybe itself is a composition of several functions, like layers. I mean, this is you can think any neural network work in this way, not only those for graphs, right? All the times you have something works this way. So the idea now is to compute this, this phi of X in a smart way. And it's the same story as before, but the problem, in a sense, is that when you do this mapping, you should preserve the crucial information about the task, whatever it is, classification. You can do regression, you can do different things, right? Because most likely you would compress information and not necessarily maintain everything, okay? So you could do that in some unsupervised fashion, right? What could it be? You could use some autoencoders, for example. Try to encode the graph and decode to reproduce the graph itself, and that will give you a representation of the graph. People in the 90s were thinking in these terms. Jordan Pollack, for example, invented an architecture called recursive auto-associated memories that essentially does this trick, and you can learn this representation. But it's better if you learn this representation for the task that you have, if you have supervised data. Okay? And so the idea is to see methods that will learn this representation based on supervision for the task. There are different, again, problems, okay? Again, representation of what? It depends. So if X is a graph and you find the representation for the graph, it means you want to do graph classification. If you want to do classification of individual vertices, you need a representation of the vertex. If you want to do link prediction, you need a representation of pairs of vertices. Right? You need to learn that. So those are slightly different things. And some of the methods can do both. Some of the methods can only do one. So you need to take care and look at what they do, right? Because not necessarily you can use the same method for both, right? And again, the other pattern, like propagation versus decomposition, you can also apply these two patterns here. Most approaches are based on propagation for neural networks. But you can also do something based on decomposition. I'll show you something at the end, if I have time. Okay? So let's start with propagation things. And, oh, sorry. There is also another issue. That's very important. For example, if you want to do classification on the individual vertices, right? When you classify individual vertices, you can be transductive or inductive. You know what is the difference between inductive learning and transductive learning? In general, not in the relational case, but in general. So inductive means what? That I give you a new X, and you have to make your predictions. And during the training phase, you didn't even know what the X would be, what the query point would be for your system. Okay? In transductive learning, it's different. In transductive learning, I give you your labeled examples, but I also give you the test points. I just don't give you the labels of the test points. But I will tell you in advance what are the questions for your exam, in a sense. I don't give you the answers, but you will know. As a student, you will know where you will be interrogated on, right? So you can prepare on that. So transductive learning, in principle, you have a lot more information. And now, when you have these graph methods, some of the approaches only work in the transductive setting. So they can only solve the easiest kind of setting. They cannot do inductive learning on new graphs, on new things. Okay? So one example, very simple. Let's say you want to do protein-protein interaction or to do protein function prediction based on the protein-protein interaction networks. Okay? Well, one network could be, I don't know, the proteins in a particular animal. Let's say in the mouse, right? And then you have another network, which is the same bunch of proteins. It's different proteins because, another animal could have different proteins, but some are related. It could be human, for example, right? And you want to find something to cure a disease for humans, and maybe you have information in the mouse, and you want to transfer this information to the humans. Well, those are two separate networks, of course. There is no interaction between the proteins in the mouse and the proteins in the humans, hopefully, right? But some of the methods cannot do this transfer. They can only work inside one particular network where maybe some of the proteins are labeled with their function. You know where the other proteins are. You don't know the label for these new proteins, and you do the prediction for these new proteins. But you cannot exploit the method to transfer this information now to humans, to a new network. So you have to be careful about the ability of your method to be inductive, because in some cases, this is what you want. Another thing is that The embedding, okay, the embedding means mapping graph or vertices into vectors, right? Can be either task-driven or maybe just similarity-driven. There is a whole bunch of methods, which I don't mention except here, right? Are you familiar with word-to-vec? How many of you know word-to-vec? Okay, so word-to-vec is an approach to convert words into vectors, to do an embedding of words, right? How does it work? Essentially looking into co-occurrences of words into documents, okay? Word-to-vec is one particular approach to that, which is, a particular way based on soft hierarchical softmax tricks, or the continuous bag of words approach. But you can do it in many ways. You can do it with recurrent neural networks, but you can also do similar things looking at co-occurrences of vertices in networks. All these methods are inherently, in a sense, transductive, okay? Because you need the identifiers of the vertices before you can do something. So if you want to do something inductive, well, no way, okay? There is one paper, which is, the title, I think is Deep Graph Kernels, where they mix up the strategies and they actually come up with an inductive algorithm, okay? They still use this idea of word-to-vec, of embedding the parts, in a sense, and treating them in words. But, I'm not going to talk about this particular kind of approaches because they're not task-driven, okay? They do the embedding without being informed why you want to do this embedding. It's a general embedding. It's like unsupervised way of finding the embedding. I want to do something which is supervised, informed by the task. Very old approach. That was the early 90s, well, mid-90s. It's called recursive neural networks, okay? That was invented by these two guys who were actually after a very special problem. There was, theorem provers in first-order logic, right? They basically need a search algorithm to find the proof. And, well, like in every search algorithm, you need heuristics to accelerate the search, okay, to go and find a goal quickly. And, well, since in some problems you have no idea what is a good heuristic, they wanted to learn the heuristic starting from examples of successfully proved theorems. Well, they invented this recursive neural network for this purpose, okay? They didn't have in mind other problems like the ones I was talking about that came a bit later. The idea is the following. You can only apply this idea to directed and acyclic graphs. That's a big, big, big limitation, right? And you do the embedding in a recursive way. How? Well, H will be the notation for the embedding of vertex B, okay? And X will be the notation for the attributes at vertex B, like the element, the chemical element, when this is a molecule, or when it's a citation network, X of V, V is a paper, and X of V is the abstract and the title and the authors of the paper, right? All the information about the paper. Okay, now the idea is the following, that the embedding at this vertex is computed by differentiable function f, parameterized by some weights, w, that depends on the contents at V and the embeddings of the children of V. Okay? That's fairly simple. Let's look at an example. So let's say this is your graph, and you want to do the embedding. What you do, you have this picture here is the neural network representing f, w, in this equation here. The inputs are x and the embeddings of the children. Indeed, the inputs to the neural network are the embedding of the children, and this is the label of the node. Okay? And it's a parameterized function, of course. It's differentiable because maybe here I just put one layer here, but you can put as many layers as you like and make a deep network if you like. Okay? And then what? You repeat these templates for every vertex in your graph, right? And now you have a huge computational graph. Of course, the weights are shared in the sense that this weight matrix here is the same as this one. This one. No, yeah, this one, they're all the same, right? They're all identical because it's the same function f of w repeated everywhere. But this is what? It's just a computational graph, right? So to do the gradient here, what you do? I mean, at the time, they even had to invent a special name. They call it backpropagation through structure. Okay. But today we know it's different, right? It's what? It's reverse mode algorithmic differentiation on this graph, right? So if you guys know about TensorFlow, PyTorch, all these systems, how do they compute the derivatives? Reverse mode algorithmic differentiation, right? So you got a computational graph, and you apply the chain rule in a particular way, right? You compute the partial derivatives of your output. What is the output? The loss versus, how much you change the activation source and units in the middle, in some which. Okay, so is it the same if I swap DNA here? This neural network, you see that, there are different slots in the input, right? So if this is a dense layer, it will make a difference when you swap DNA. Now, C is the only child of B. Should I put it here or here? That's the difference. Okay. So if you're naive and you just put it in the first position, it's not necessarily the best thing you can do. Okay. So for some graphs, the order of children is given in the specification of the problem. This is the case, for example, in parse trees. Because in parse trees, the children are ordered naturally. So you know exactly where to put the children. Right? You also have to put a limit on the maximum number of children. Because that would be the number of inputs to your neural network here. How many? Well, you have to decide in advance. You can say, well, I only accept 5 children, and if I have more, you truncate. It's a limitation, right? If you put like 10 slots and the 10th child only happens, in 5 trees in your data set, what kind of weights do you learn for, that input? Very poor weights. So it's better if you truncate, right? Okay, but you can apply that. We also applied this architecture for predicting disulfide bridges in proteins, which is a trick in a sense because it's a structured output problem, but you can convert into into ranking by trying all possible arrangements of the edges. The sulfide bridges are these arrows here. This is something you want to predict in proteins. It's incredibly useful. When I did this, I didn't expect that so many biologists are actually clicking on this website and then go for getting these answers. For the most desperate users, I mean, I've been invited to review papers on evolutionary genetics because they applied this method and said, no, guys, I'm a computer scientist, give me a break. I don't know this stuff. But yeah, so it works, but it also has a huge number of limitations. Okay? Huge number. No cycles, no undirected edges, problems if your neighbors have variable size. You have to truncate. Ordering of the children is a mess. What if you have molecules and you want to classify molecules? Is a molecule directed? No, there is no direction, right? What are the children and the parents? You don't know. You can impose one particular ordering, so you can put the root somewhere, but why that particular vertex? And not another one. And so one trick is to use to add a special node that will collect information from all the other vertices. But it's a hack, really, which has been used in a few cases, also successfully, also for molecules, but it's a hack. Okay? So you would like something more principled possible. Okay, so this is an evolution of recursive neural networks. It's a very smart one. If you like, this is Wasfire-Lemon implemented in neural networks. Okay? Although the authors of this paper didn't recognize that. But this is the idea. It's very similar to recursive neural networks, but it's also very different. Where is the similarity? The similarity is that when you compute the embedding, H, it's still a parameterized continuous differentiable function with weights W that depends on what you have in X of V. They also propose to take into account what you have in the neighborhood of V. The neighborhood is the set of vertices which are connected to V. Okay? And also the embedding at the neighborhood. Now, what is the main difference between this equation and this equation? In this equation, you have children and parents, so you can go bottom up. You have this computational graph, okay, and you follow it, and you go bottom up. When you write down this equation here, what is the ordering? There is no ordering. Okay? So basically, you have to start from some initial H and propagate. Like in Wasfire-Lemon. What you do in Wasfire-Lemon? Well, you do some initial labeling, like 1, 1, 1 everywhere, and you start to propagate. Okay? And the same here. You propagate, and then what? Like in Wasfire-Lemon, you do another iteration. And another one, and you keep going. Okay? In this paper, the weights don't if I well remember, don't take the iteration number into account. Okay? It's the same W. One very simple variant would be what? That the iteration number creates different weights. So at the first iteration, you have a weight matrix. At the second iteration, you have another weight matrix, and so on. That's a simple variant. Another variant is what? Well, this is a set. The neighborhood is a set. Is that ordered? Is that positional? You know the difference between ordered graph and positional graphs? Okay, so positional is, let's say, binary search trees, the ones you studied at the first year of the university, right? Then you have a left and a right child, the left child and the right child. This is positional because you know one is left, one is right. Ordered means that it's simply the first, second, third, fourth, and so on. Okay? So when a binary search tree is not ordered, it's positional because you could miss the left or you could miss the right. When it's ordered, one is the first. Okay, for sure is the first. Well, you can do things like, working on the parameterization here. I think it's easier if I show you in this picture, right? What if I put the weights here and the weights here identical? Then it's insensitive to the ordering. Okay? So you can, well, also this one you can make it insensitive to the order or to the position. And so they propose to do this also for this equation here. Because at the end of the day, this is a piece of neural network with these inputs. Okay? What about variable size neighborhoods? That's a problem. This is also a problem for them, but you can solve this in some cases because, I mean, if you reuse the same weights everywhere, it doesn't matter how many child you have or how many neighbors you have. You just reuse the same weight matrix everywhere. So you can have 1, 2, 10, 2,000, doesn't matter because you still have enough parameters. Okay? So in a sense, all these possible different variants are possible. You can also incorporate age levels if you have them. Okay? And what do? They show the following thing. I mean, under some conditions, which is explained here. When a function satisfies this equation, it's called a contraction. Okay? What is the main property of a contraction mapping? Banach theorem. It will converge to a fixed point, to a unique solution. Right? So they enforce this contraction mapping using a penalty in the optimization objective. And this is good for them. Why? Well, because at the end, they know the solution. Right? So they have a unique embedding at the end, and that's the result of the all the operation. Okay? Are you aware of any algorithm that does this message passing on a graph and converges to a unique solution? I think you use this algorithm many times every day. Or at least in principle. You don't exactly know what you use, because what is behind Google? PageRank, right? Well, at least I was behind Google many years ago. Now nobody knows, but unless you work for Google. But yeah, PageRank, the same story, right? You converge to a fixed point somehow. Yeah. So this is very much inspired. Actually, they showed they can predict PageRank or web page this way, using this architecture. But yeah. Let's say they do this iteration for many, until they reach the fixed point. Is that necessary? Maybe not. In bus file lemma, for example, you don't want to go too far away, right? This capital T will be your hyperparameter, the bus file lemma, and you stop after a few iterations, also because if you insist too much, then you will add components in the feature vector that most likely will go towards exact isomorphism, which is something you don't necessarily want because you may overfit with kernels. So, well, so those are maybe naive points about this paper, but this paper has been reused by many other people in the subsequent years. Okay. Gradients. How do you compute the gradients? That's an interesting question. How do you compute the gradients here? You can do reverse mode algorithmic differentiation, of course, because you can do the computational graph for a given capital T. Okay, when you fix the capital T, you have a computational graph. You can do reverse mode algorithmic differentiation. No problem. What is the problem? Maybe to do reverse mode, you have to keep in memory everything. That's the way it works. Okay? And in particular, you have to keep in memory all the embeddings at every time step for all the vertices. So if you have a huge network, well, that might be expensive if T is like 1,000. So you might end up with problems with your memory. It's not the running time, it's really the memory, which is a problem. This problem has been studied quite heavily in the hyperparameter optimization community when you use gradient-based methods for hyperparameter optimization. It's the very same problem. Reverse mode algorithmic differentiation has these memory problems. There are some tricks to solve it, like doing, for example, forward mode, but they use a very simple trick. The simple trick, again, goes back to the 80s. It's the famous Almeida-Pineda approximation of backpropagation through time, which is just you take the fixed point and you pretend that the entire history is the fixed point. Instead of looking at the evolution of the embeddings over the iterations, well, you keep the last one and you pretend everything is the same and you compute the gradients. It's an approximation, but somehow it still works. Okay? And so that's what I did. Other people have observed that contraction implies a problem. Contraction implies what? Are you kind of familiar with dynamical systems or system theory? What is an example of linear system which is contractive? When it's asymptotically stable, meaning what? That the eigenvalues are always more than 1. What happens in a system like that? You put some input on some point, the system starts to evolve, and where it goes? To 0. Forgets everything, right? So if you impose this contraction mapping, basically a vertex here will never be able to communicate information to a distant vertex over there. Also, even if there is a path, the information is a contraction, so it will go down slowly. So they will never reach each other. So this vertex will never be informed about something that's here. Whereas in spiral lemma, if you do enough iterations, eventually you do propagate this information over there. Okay. So here, other people have proposed, for example, to use gated units. You know what the gated units? How many of you know long short-term memories? All right. Why people invented long short-term memories? to solve the long-term dependencies problem in recurrent neural networks, okay, to get these good gradients. And so it's the same story here. We apply these Gaussian networks and remove the contraction requirement. Actually, the contraction requirement is not really necessary, but that was only understood a bit later on in time. Okay? And the idea is to extend convolution neural networks. Why convolution neural networks? Let's see. So, if you don't know what is a convolutional neural network, this is a state-of-the-art in computer vision. Okay? All the fancy neural networks you look in the press, they win the awards, they're all based on this very simple trick invented by Fukushima in the 80s and reused by Jan LeCun also in the 80s for handwritten character recognition. And there's a very simple idea that you move a kernel or filter in a given order. I mean, this is not animated, but to compute the value here, you just take the square over here, and you do the dot product between this matrix and a particular filter, and you compute this value here. Then you move, for example, to compute this one, you just use this 3x3 object, and you move this stuff everywhere, right? And you get another image. Well, this convolutional operation can be understood in different ways, and that will give you different convolutional networks for graphs. Right? So let's see. I mean, there are at least these two different approaches, but maybe more than that. So the first of all, you can imagine that this convolution is actually a message passing algorithm, pretty much like phosphorolemon, to some extent. Again, it doesn't look like it. I mean, if you think about it, it is. So that's the mathematical definition of the operation for two-dimensional images. Okay? So the embedding at position ij in the filter map will be the convolutional product of the weight matrix times the signal, the image x, at position ij. And how do you compute it? In this way. Okay? You just shift the filter in all possible positions. Okay? For a given filter size, which will be the end of the summations here, which I don't denote, but let's say I prime could go from, I don't know, 0 to 3, for example, right? And then it will be a filter size of 4. Well, this is exactly the same as sending a message in a graph. Which graph? If you look at these operations here, who's sending a message to whom? Can you visualize in your mind from the equation? Or maybe you can look at that, maybe it's easier, right? Well, the neighbors are sending messages, right? So let's do an example here. And here the filter size is 3, right? And basically, this is the graph over which the message passing happens. Okay? Those are the edges in the graph, as this particular kind of grid, right? And here you do the calculations in this way. Basically, to get the embedding in this blue guy, you start from all the orange guys and the blue guy itself, and you send messages. So there is also a message from the blue guys itself. And the colors are what? The different weights. So this is one filter. There's 9 numbers, 9 different colors. It's just one filter. That computes the embedding for the next layer of the convolutional network. Okay? Well, you can do the same for a graph. This way, right? That's a bit more tricky now. Why? Because here you know the ordering, you know the positions, you know how to do it. In a general graph, how the hell you do it? Right? Well, the colors should explain the trick. You use black for the self message, and you use the same weight everywhere for the neighbors. Same color everywhere, right? This is what Kip and Wellen did a few years ago. Just use the same weight. It's a very simple idea. Actually, in this other paper by Duvenel, they propose to use weight which is dependent on the degree. But this one just works better. Okay. So that's the idea. I don't hear you, sorry? No, it was not intentional. Which one is missing? Okay, thank you. So please delete this from your mind. Don't see it. Pretend you don't see it. I know there are errors in the slides. You know, smart people see that. Thank you. Okay. So, what is the difference compared to Vasfara lemma? This is actually in their paper, this derivation here. I think it's smart to look at that. So, in Vasfara lemma, you don't have an embedding, you have a coloring, right? Well, that's the same story. The color, time t plus 1, an iteration t plus 1 in Vasfara lemma, with just the hash of some concatenation operation over the colors in the neighbors. Okay. Here, in graph convolutional, you have a sigmoid, maybe, or some nonlinear operation of this weight times the embedding over there. Okay. What is C? C is there because, if a node has 2 neighbors, another node has 2,000 neighbors. Obviously, when you go sum, it makes a difference, right? So it's like trying to get this like a stochastic matrix to some extent, where you normalize, right? And they normalized using the geometric means of the 2 degrees. Of the 2 vertices which are communicating, to avoid, inequality, strange, unequal treatments. W is t dependent. That's important. So the idea is that a layer in a convolutional network is like one Vasfara lemma iteration. Okay, so at the first iteration, you have the first layer, second iteration, third iteration, and so on, and the weights are different. This is different from what Gori and Scarcelli did with their graph neural network model, where the weights was the same everywhere. Okay, that's a major difference. Layer dependent or iteration dependent weights. That's a major difference. Of course, I did the picture here with scalars, a single filter. You can use an array of filters. Like a convolutional network, you don't use a single filter, you use many filters. Same story here. H and W can be vectors, right? The equation doesn't really change, just the interpretation of the equation that changes. And, we applied that on citation networks. These are, I think they're So well, remember the task is to classify the topic of the paper. Yeah, I have 10 minutes, I know. But actually, I have 15 minutes or maybe 20 because I started later and I got an interruption. But anyway. Okay, so it works. There is another interpretation of convolution that gives you another algorithm for doing convolutions of graphs. So this is by Matthias Niepert, who's, by the way, is in the audience. No, not yet. He's supposed to come to lecture here at some point. Yeah. Anyway, so actually, you can think about the convolution as visiting the graph and applying this mask, right? Like in these animations that you find this website, when you move the filter everywhere, it's like visiting the graph, right? And so this is your ordering of visiting. What happens when you do that? Well, quite simply, I mean, it's just a sequence of objects. You can apply one-dimensional convolution to the sequence. And at each step, what happens? Let's say, sorry, this one, yeah, it's like this. So black, white, 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 black, white. There's this guy here. If you linearize this matrix, you get this vector here, right? And you feed it into a filter for computing the next layer of the embedding. And if you follow the ordering, the computation is well defined and is actually identical to the two-dimensional convolution, right? If you share the weights in the proper way. So it's a different interpretation of convolution, but with this interpretation, again, you can do the same trick for graphs. So you just visit. So now you have your node, you select your neighbors. Actually, they have a flexible definition neighbors. It's like in NSPDK, more than the neighbor is like a ball around the vertex. So they can also select vertices at distance 2, okay, from this red point. And then they do some normalization. What they mean by normalization is not just dividing by the norm. Not forget it. Normalization for them means that you have to find an ordering. That's tricky. And then you have to truncate, maybe, if you exceed the maximum length. Okay, like I mentioned before for recursive neural networks, you might have to truncate. And they construct the receptive field in this way. Okay, and then they order the vertices, and they apply, they apply one-dimensional convolution to the ordered sequence of vertices. Of course, there is an issue here. You can see that very well. How the hell do you define the ordering if the graph is not ordered in the first place? What do you suggest for ordering? The degree. Could be, but think about this graph. Every node has the same degree about, right? You could do some attributes, or you could use Vasper-Lemma for ordering, right? For example, why not? You could do some propagation. Actually, I think they really did something closely. I don't remember exactly what they did, but maybe you can ask Matthias tomorrow if you want the details. But I think they did some message passing to do the ordering. But the ordering is quite crucial because when you change the ordering, everything changes. So it's very important. And also they have this fixed neighborhood size. And this is problematic, not really on molecules, But it's problematic where? On citation networks, it's problematic. Because you have to truncate, and if a paper is very famous and got, 1,000 citations, well, you have to truncate, and that's not very nice, right? So, in a sense, this is, there is a big super advantage, right? That you can do the embedding for the whole graphs. This is something you cannot do with the Kipton-Welling method. Indeed, Kipton-Welling didn't apply that to, how's it called? Molecule classification. They only did it for vertex classification, right? But it works. Anyway, this is Pachesan, and they applied that. You see the data set, molecules, proteins, the same stuff you have seen before for graph kernels, and they are compared against graph kernels, and in many cases they work even better, because you learn the embedding anyway. And also, they applied that on social network data sets. In spite of the fact that they have to truncate, they still work nicely. So it still works. Finally, let me mention more recent work by, this is the Stanford group, and it's called GraphSage. Is very similar to convolution over graphs and to bispiral lemma strategies and to the graph neural network model by Gordon Scarcelli. Except it's an evolution of that idea, to some extent, where basically they use a differentiable aggregation operation, right, on the neighborhoods, whatever it is. So instead of summing, this aggregator could be, for example, an LSTM, if you have some ordering, could be max pooling, could be an average. They experiment with different things, but that's basically the only difference. The idea is the same, is message passing, okay? And this is their pseudocode, but really it's the same algorithm as Gordon Scarcelli proposed, except they don't go to the fixed point. They use different weights at different distances, at different iterations. So for every t, the A depends on t, so the weights depend on t. And it's just a neural network that does everything. Also learns how to do the aggregation. They were smart enough to obtain quite nice results. So for example, the neighborhood sample, this is, I forgot to mention, a major difference is that they don't fix the neighborhoods. To solve the truncation problem, they sample the neighborhood size, and they sample the neighbors. So they say, well, for example, my neighborhood size is 25. It means that when I have 1,000 citations, I take a sample of this 1,000 citation of 25, of size 25. And that's on a particular mini batch. On another mini batch during gradient descent, I sample another subset. Okay, so it's a randomized algorithm to some extent. The samples the number of neighbors all the time. And of course, the higher the neighbor size, the better the performance increases. Okay. All right. So this is only a few methods out there, but the population is pretty large. If you look around, there are dozens of papers, mostly very closely related, I would say. Sometimes they don't credit each other properly, but that's life. I think two problems. One is, so if you want to work on that, I think it's still open. So feel free to start working on that, because there is very little theory to understand the expressivity of these models. Okay. And also experimentally, what is really missing, all these little variants. I mean, if you take GraphSage, yes, that's the last one, right? I mean, they report good performances on some data sets which are completely different from the data sets on which previous methods were tested. So which one was better and why? And under which conditions? Nobody knows. Well, everything is on GitHub. All these methods are downloadable. Still, go and try. Well, good luck, right? See whether you can reproduce the results that are in the other groups. It's not always easy, believe me. Okay? Versions of software, hyperparameters, that you know how to tune the hyperparameters. It's a nightmare. So someone should do the job of, clarifying the situation. Data sets are many around to do this. So if you have time and you want to do the study and you fill in this matrix with all these methods and the right ablations, meaning that you cut down from a model a particular feature to see whether performance goes up or down, and you understand what is crucial, even experimentally without theorems, I think you will make a paper with 1,000 citations. So if you have time, but maybe you should team up, because there's a lot of energy to do that. Nobody's really, I mean, I'm a lazy person, I will never do that, but feel free, okay? All right, so this one I think I will skip, except I will give you a hint of something you can do with that. I don't have time to explain the method, but I will just try to give you a hint of what you can do, because I think that could be very closely related to what Luke was talking about this morning on deep droplog. So maybe this stuff can be also solved with deep droplog. Let's see. So let's say this is your data. It's called multi-instance because data is a set of bags of bags. And now this bag here, for example, is positive, and this bag here is negative, and the criterion here is to be positive, you need an instance of class 7, but no instance of class 3 in the bag. Okay, so this is good because you have a 7 and a 3. This, you have a 7, but you also have a 3, so it's negative. And the entire thing is positive if you have at least one green guy. Right, so generalization of multi-instance learning. This one is negative because there is no positive guy. Okay, so we did this for this problem here. Let's see if I have the results in terms of numbers. This is the logical rule. It's positive when you have this stuff, or this stuff, or this stuff. It's class 2, you have this stuff, this stuff, or this stuff. And it's class 3 otherwise. So it's 3 classes. And the entire thing is positive if there is at least a subbag, of maybe class 2, for example. So you can write down this in logical terms. Well, it works with 96% accuracy. Okay, so you can learn this rule. And one cool thing about this idea is that you can recover the logical rule from the weights of the network after learning. So you can interpret the model. And I will just finish showing you some interpretations for when you apply this to sentiment analysis. So these are IMDb reviews. And the problem here is to classify reviews, whether it's positive or negative for the movie. And you represent a review as a set of sentences, and each sentence as a set of triplets of consecutive words. Okay, so it's a bag of bags. And these are, the interpretation in terms of topics that you discover. So this is when a unit will be active. Okay. This unit is active when you're introducing something in a sentence. This unit is active, guess what? When you get a very high opinion about the movie. And this is acting when you have a very negative opinion about the movie? Is it useful? I mean, if you have to write a recommendation letter and you run out of imagination on what kind of adjectives to use, this is fantastic, right? And same for sentences. You have units that activate when, and you can understand why. So you can highlight in the review why some things activate this or not. So you can get an interpretation. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here. Questions, please.
In convolutional neural networks, you have so-called pool layers in order to improve the training and simply improve the training. So is there any equivalent for graph convolutional networks?
Look at that. Is what? Is an aggregator, right?
Yes.
I mean, pooling is just one particular case of aggregation.
That's true. Okay, so it's the same, the network it's play the same role in the learning?
Sorry?
Let's say the max pool is used to favor some features learned by the layer. So in the same way, this aggregation function could average over weights.
So, in a sense, they are cheating where they say that it's fully trainable. It means that they encode the structure of the kind of computation the aggregation should be, and what is learnable is just some of the parameters of this aggregation. So if you want to do max pooling versus average pooling, then you have to explicitly make this choice in advance. So in a sense, this choice will be a hybrid parameter of your method that you have to fix in advance.
Okay.
But yeah, I understand that it will be even better if you could actually do learn how to aggregate things. Yeah.
Any other question?
All right, guys.
Thanks again.